Hello and welcome back to another Monster Monday, a series where I draw a creature from D&D and I talk about its lore and its mythology and what it's like to fight in-game as well. In these videos I like to use your suggestions for monsters that you'd like to see me draw and hear the lore and mythology of, because there are so many that I just cannot keep up with what I want to draw, so I like to hear your choices. So if while you're watching this video you suddenly think of a monster that you'd really like to see me draw, whether it's one that you suggested a long time ago or something that you'd just like to see in D&D now, don't forget to put that in the comments section, because I will add up every single one of your suggestions and hand it to my patrons each month so that they can vote on which ones are their favourites, and I can make videos about your suggestions. Now today's topic, the will-o'-wisp, was first suggested almost a year ago I think on my Grung video by Alexia VVA. It has been sitting at the top of my Patreon's voting list for such a long time. I really thought this was going to be a video that I made sooner, because Alexia has been championing this for ages, commenting on almost all of my videos for a really long time. But more monstrous and hideous and grotesque creatures have always stolen the limelight away from this guy before I've had a chance to draw it. But I'm super glad to have the chance to talk about them now, because they have some absolutely amazing lore, they're really interesting creatures, they're actually super lethal, and I've actually had a character nearly die to one of these. The last character that I played nearly got absolutely destroyed by one of these things, which may be a little bit surprising actually. But anyway, I don't want to give away too much before we actually start. Let's get started with today's video and talk about the will-o'-wisp. In D&D, will-o'-wisps are tiny undead who haunt long-forgotten places where death was once, or perhaps still is, rife. These places were usually the sites of great and gruesome battles, or simply tortured and lonely places where terrible acts have been committed. And in their aftermath, blood, rot, and the malevolence of history has soaked into the earth and saturated the area. These dens of evil often become overgrown and lost to history, but the tarnish of murder still hangs over this region, forming lost mires, stinking swamps, and forests of perpetual twilight. Adventurers can be forgiven for presuming that will-o'-wisps are fey creatures. They take the form of little balls of light, which look enchanting and beautiful, especially in contrast to the usually grim and unsettling landscapes that they call home. Navi, from the various Legend of Zelda games, is usually a fitting comparison, but whereas Navi's consistent "Hey, listen!" may be enough to drive someone to fall on their own sword, the will-o'-wisp will have no trouble ending an adventurer without having to resort to annoying them to death. The D&D will-o'-wisp is probably best exemplified in The Lord of the Rings, when Gollum leads Frodo and Sam through the Dead Marshes, a former battlefield littered with dead elves, men, and orcses, whose centuries-old bodies decorate the many pools that wait in the mists. In this fetid mire, which Tolkien largely created to showcase the horrific conditions of the Battle of the Somme, which he participated in, Frodo becomes entranced by dancing lights that add a sense of macabre beauty to the otherwise relentless horror of this zone. These lights that Gollum refers to as candles for corpses, which he urges the two hobbits not to follow, as those who touch these pools or become enchanted by these lights quickly join the dead below the water. Tolkien in turn most likely uses these flames and torches of the dead as a reference to the Grendel's home in the Old English poem Beowulf, which mentions in this particular passage, quote, "Well-rooted trees overshadow the water. There one may, each night, a horrible wonder see, fire on the water. This is not a safe place." End quote. But rather than simply flames of the dead, ignitions of their souls, or perhaps manifestations of the ire of those in the heat of battle, lingering after death, in D&D, wisps are spirits of particularly wicked people, or echoes of violent deeds, which coalesce into semi-tangible spheres of light, which hover through ancient lands, absolutely obsessed with their own suffering, misery, and their hatred for the living. Their peculiar beauty is actually one of the chief weapons that they employ, making sure to ensnare the attention of lost travellers, who may hope to escape their plight by following these fey-like illuminations, only to be directed into quicksand pits, off of the edge of cliffs, or otherwise into some other form of dire peril. And this dire peril and fear that those who fall victim to their lures in the dark sustains a wisp. It feeds on their terror, misery, and ultimately their life force, which they slowly drain from them as this creature dies lost and alone. If their ghostly light is not enough of a distraction to draw someone off course in an unfamiliar and hostile marsh or ruin, the will-o'-wisp may choose to whisper, throwing their voices as a nightmarish ASMR ventriloquist might into the fog in the hopes of tormenting or baiting their foes. Wisps don't like to speak. It reminds them too much of their former lives, a thought which feels uncomfortable to their now twisted minds. But they are perfectly capable of communicating in hushed whispers, in any of the languages they may have known in life. They will often use these communication skills to form a kind of hunting symbiosis with other more corporeal malevolent beings who wander through their misty graveyards, being especially fond of Oni, hags, and black dragons, lending their unsettlingly ridiculous level of power to this creature in exchange for the opportunity to, quote, drink the agony of a last breath, according to the monster manual, when this more corporeal creature comes to slaughter a vulnerable mortal. And this sounds like a pretty fine deal for any evil creature, if you ask me. Now, these creatures, like most of the monsters that come to us in 5th edition, first appeared in 1st edition's monster manual, released in 1977, and they have, at least visually, changed very little since those early days. But they're one of the few creatures that I've come across in all of my research that actually has 2 different articles in Dragon Magazine, posted at different times, exclusively dedicated to their ecology and behaviour. One written by Nigel D. Findlay, printed in 1985, for issue 99, and another released in 2005, authored by Amber Scott, for issue 328. In Nigel D. Findlay's article, we're told a little more about the nature of their semi-tangibility, which has always perplexed me a little. We're told that, quote, the Elven manuscript describes the adult will-o'-the-wisp as a lattice of information with no material substance, a scroll with no parchment. The sage writes much as is a symbol or a cleric's glyph of warding. It is crystalline energy, self-sustaining, and potentially immortal, end quote. Wisps are equal parts material and spirit. Usually, the incorporeal, shadows, spectres, ghosts, poltergeists, and so on, are a challenge for adventuring parties who rely too heavily on martial damage and physical defences. A DM hoping to exploit their party's reliance on a single tactic will usually introduce, hopefully with heavy foreshadowing so that they can prepare, an ethereal or otherwise intangible antagonist for their players to fight, so that none of their attacks will harm this opponent, forcing players to really think ahead of time about what they should do to be ready for a fight with this creature, or to encourage their players to be resourceful and utilise their environment somehow to survive the encounter. But generally speaking, the only way to harm such a creature is through the use of magic. Magical evocation spells or magical weapons are capable of harming even spirits. Indeed, this was even apparently the case with the little wisp in the quality assurance or development phase of 5th edition, but wisps are also designed to be a low-level threat for early adventuring parties who may not yet have had the good fortune to come across magical weapons of that nature. So players were becoming slaughtered by these little orbs of light that occupy no more than a foot of space. While the 5th edition wisp can move incorporeally, allowing it to drift through people and solid objects as if they were a video game sprite that they could just clip through, they can still be harmed by physical attacks. They're just resistant to non-magical forms of attack: fire, necrotic damage, cold, and acid damage, taking half damage instead of none at all. As a tiny orb of light, they're also immune to being grappled, paralysed, and knocked prone, being restrained or becoming unconscious. Additionally, as an undead creature, they don't need to eat, drink, sleep, breathe. They can't be exhausted or poisoned because there's not a physical body to poison or harm in any way. While their ability to be harmed physically has always been absolutely necessary, it hasn't always gelled with me because they're supposed to be literally just angry little lights. I've sometimes included these in my steampunk setting, changing their creature type to a hybrid undead or construct, and having them be trapped spirits housed inside some sort of light bulb-esque enchanted Tesla coils or floating mechanical skulls like the famous servitor skulls of the Warhammer 40,000 franchise, as a means of explaining how they would be hurt by physical attacks. But this allusion in the ecology article to the wisp being crystallized thought or spirit definitely feels like a beautiful, high fantasy, lore-friendly way to allow these creatures to be harmed while still being light in some capacity. Fascinatingly, rather than being an undead monster, the will-o'-wisp was once considered a fey creature, a title they held all the way up until the end of 4th edition. In these earlier interpretations, wisps were fully fledged creatures who, rather than being drawn from corpses of evil or malevolent people, or becoming echoes of regrets left to haunt creepy bogs and marshes, they had their own societies. We are told that they have rites, rituals, and may even worship gods, although what gods they worship is unclear. They even reproduce to continue their species and don't consider their incorporeality a curse. We're told, quote, "How does an intangible creature as the will-o'-wisp reproduce? The question has oft been asked, but never before answered. The Elven manuscript proposes the following. There are 3 genders of will-o'-wisp," I'm sure they meant biological sexes, "to all intents and purposes identical in appearance, powers and behaviour. All are required for the production of an offspring. The reproductive act itself takes place usually deep within an impenetrable marsh, necessary to protect the participants. The 3 will-o'-wisps draw close together and apparently merge their forms together, becoming one. The event is over in a moment. Almost immediately, the tripartite will-o'-wisp flares to intolerable brightness, then splits once more into 3. Left behind is an infant boggart. If one wished to destroy a will-o'-wisp, now would be the ideal time, since the 3 parents are in a severely weakened state after their mating. Mating appears to take place in cycles. Adult will-o'-wisps congregate rarely, but when they do, they tend to mate 3 or sometimes more times within a period of about a week. When the boggarts are born, parents share the nursing chores. After the boggarts are capable of hunting, the parents leave them to fend for themselves. The boggarts, however, tend to stay together. I know not whether for social reasons or simply because 3 can hunt more effectively than 1 until they reach maturity." End quote. It's definitely a sign of the times that these were written referring to 3 genders rather than biological sexes, but we've all had some learning to do, and there are definitely far more problematic things in Dungeons & Dragons that we have to worry about. It's interesting though, the idea of a triptych of biological sexes which go into their reproduction is something that rarely comes up in fantasy media, and is definitely something that I'd love to include in my own campaigns somehow. Boggarts are described as their offspring as well in this article, which brings up more questions, because boggarts are very corporeal house spirits that actually feature in D&D. Do boggarts ascend to incorporeality and become wisps, or did this article mean something different at first? The later ecology article brings the wisp more in line with more modern interpretations of the wisp, but I'm fascinated by all the questions and role-playing potential that this early article might present DMs. I'm curious as to whether or not you consider these creatures undead or fey, if they are animals, spirits, fairies, or if, like in 5th edition, they are undead souls, burning with regret. Hello there, sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank all of my patrons over on Patreon for their support, but in particular, I wanted to give a shout out to all of the wonderful patrons who are backing me at the Silver Archfey level. This month you are Nicholas G. Silver, Raptor Dio, Jelly Pig, Duck Quack, Nap in Camo, Jonathan Foster, Benjamin Colburn, Yorick Beast, Ethan Dibby, Skyrush Soul, Nathan Stratton, Amanda and Jake Westfall, Ken Doman, Peter Balfe, Max Schluter, Ryan H., Tim Kleemer, Steve Harrison, Dan Waterman, Styrax, Colby Monroe, It's Just Avi, Sam Hickson, Brandon Kerr, Bork Boulderbender, Darth Caetana, Trevor Traub, Max Copeland, Oliver Thorvald Mellock, Dominique Jolly, AJ, Tamerling, Aldrin, Christian Palmer-Smith, and Brandon Wilkinson. If you're interested in joining the little community that we have over on Patreon, I'll make sure to leave a link to that down below in my description box. Patrons get access to loads and loads of rewards, like this shout out, but there are also shout outs for every single patron on my monthly live stream. Every patron is entered into a raffle at the beginning of each month, where one person is randomly selected for a character illustration that might get made into a commission corner video. If you're interested in getting a commission, they get copies of all of the artwork that I do each month, which includes the video that you're watching right now. They get Patreon exclusive videos that are about my lore, my homebrew world, and my adventures in D&D. And some of us get to have one-on-one chats every month where we get to talk, and I can do some drawing for you, including things like drawing a commission while we chat. But anyway, I've taken up far too much of your time, but thank you so much for helping me to thank these guys, and I'll let you get back to your video. Cheers! Tales of the Will-o'-wisp appear in all sorts of different cultures, mythologies, and real-world spiritual practices, so there are so many fascinating ways to make these creatures your own by drawing upon ideas from all over the world, sometimes referred to by the Latin title Ignis Fatuus, meaning the giddy flame. Most stories present the wisp as a light, or more usually an ethereal or spiritual flame, which provides home for lost and weary travellers alone in the dark and terrifying and misty parts of the world, only to lead them to distraction and potentially to harm as well. Sometimes they act as a gate into another fairy-like plane, a guiding light that confounds travellers and leads them through the mists deeper into the forest, where they cross over into another world and are never heard from again. Ancient fishermen in Bangladesh reported tales of the Aliva, a marsh ghost light, which led people to run their fishing vessels across rocks, resulting in many crew members being lost at sea. Along the Indian-Pakistani border, tales of the Chir Bati illuminating the salt flats and wet marshlands are very common. The Japanese Hitodama are very frequently illustrated balls of spherical energy. They're so common in Japanese legends that they have many names for these spirit balls, including the Aborage, the Koemombi, the Ashianibi, and potentially more. Most commonly, these orbs burn in graveyards and are said to represent the energy left behind after a person's death. But more cheerful folktales also include the Kitsunibi, orbs of fire which are produced when two kitsunes, magical fox spirits, marry one another, and these Kitsunibi float around their tails. All 9 of them. The Australian Min Min light, which floats across the outback, often following lost people in the dark. Because everything wants to kill you in Australia, many people have fired weapons at these lights, which seemingly disperse them, only for them to reappear later and continue to follow travellers. The spook lights in Missouri, the Saskatchewan phenomenon of the St. Louis light, the Marfa lights of Texas, and the Paulding light of Michigan show that this spectral phenomenon has made its way into the folklore of the American continent, and even in contemporary folklore all across the world. People who believe that ghosts and spirits exist in our world and study paranormal phenomenon with their cameras and other mythical devices capture dust-like particles in their video feeds, which they call orbs, and are said to represent the activity of spirits manifesting themselves. There are dozens more of these peculiar lights throughout the world, all following the same theme of a spiritual flame or orb which floats in the darkness, and in some way represents fairies, otherworldly spirits, or the souls of the dead. So it's really hard to pin down one specific original progenitor concept that all of these cultures have sprung from, that we're all inspired by. This may be a concept that dates back long before the written word, and could be prehistoric by our cultural understanding. One thing we can pin down, though, is the name will-o'-the-wisp, which has a very clear etymological origin. The title will-o'-the-wisp, or wisp, used to refer to these spirit balls comes from the British Isles, and is likely English or perhaps Irish in origin. And because some of these early stories which feature this word vary so wildly, we couldn't make up our minds. Some of these stories are more familiar than others. In some stories, the will-o'-the-wisp is called the jack-o'-lantern, or the less popular friar's lantern, the hobby lantern, and my own now personal British term for this phenomenon, the hinky punk, which sounds like an adorable miniature version of the Sex Pistols, who float around highlighting the malevolence of Margaret Thatcher. While I desperately want to talk about jack-o'-lantern and the fascinating mythology there, I fear that this video is already going to be far too long to talk about here, so we'll have to save that lore for another video. But the premise is very similar. A wisp used to refer to a bundle of sticks, or paper, sometimes used as a torch by ancient Britons and Celtic people throughout the Isles. And will is deliberately left vague. Like Jack of Jack-o'-the-Lantern or Jack-o'-lantern, it can refer to an actual person, the Jack, or in case the Will or William, to whom this wisp, this burning lantern might have belonged to, but it also means will, as in the willpower, the essence and drive of the wisp, the personality of this sentient flame, the soul in this fire, as it were. Now, while there is a sort of ethereal, spiritual reasoning and understanding for this phenomenon, there's also some very real science that goes into why this might appear. The general consensus among the scientific community is that the oxidation of various gases that form in bodies during decomposition and organic decay can somehow spontaneously ignite on contact with oxygen in the air, and some of these gases, which are particularly volatile, like methane, that is produced when the body starts to break down after death, create quite bright and haunting fires. It's also said that phosphine produces phosphorus pentoxide as a byproduct of this burning effect, some of which settles into something called phosphoric acid upon contact with water vapour in these marshy areas, which lingers in the dew or in the mists of bogs and marshes, and is believed to be a reasonable explanation for why ectoplasm, or some sort of slimy viscous jelly, is often seen accompanying sightings of these will-o'-the-wisps. Now, one of the consistent themes in D&D associated with the wisp is its shocking and electrical power. One of the main attacks that it has is a lightning damage spark, which deals 2d8 electrical damage, and I was unsure, with all of this talk of the wisp being spiritual energy or a burning flame, why this was the case and it didn't do, necrotic or fire damage instead. A gentleperson by the name of Alessandro Volta in 1776 first proposed the concept that it was actually natural electrical discharges like lightning or static interacting with methane deposits in marshes, perhaps through the decomposition of organic material like bodies, or perhaps simply lingering in these bogs and marshes of their own accord. This original spark started these flames, and certainly sounds like a very reasonable explanation for why the off-gassing of a decomposing body would suddenly burst into flame. Indeed, there were many critics of the concept that this was simply the gases left behind by decomposing bodies or other organic creatures and materials, until such lightning-like phenomena were recorded, well up until the mid-1800s. Now, will-o'-the-wisps are only challenge rating 2 creatures, and efforts have been made to allow these creatures to be more survivable by players. As I mentioned earlier on, there was a change during development from them being completely intangible to them being semi-tangible, but in my opinion they're still deserving of a much higher challenge rating than a CR2 because of their sheer lethality. They have an armor class of 19 because they're so small and really hard to hit. So it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to actually hit one of these creatures at low level, even if they weren't partially incorporeal. But if you do manage to damage them, if you manage to beat this 19 armor class, then you'll still be likely going to be only doing half damage to them because they're resistant to everything tangible. They have a 2d8 damage lightning attack, and they can become invisible at will, which makes them a truly terrifying opponent without anything else in combination here. They're a great stealth, undead creature that has a pretty significant attack. The most deadly thing about these creatures, though, is their Dementor's kiss, their ability to drain life out of a helpless victim. They have an ability, not an action, but a feature called Consume Life that says that as a bonus action, the will-o'-the-wisp can target one creature it can see within 5 feet of it that has 0 HP and is still alive. So this is someone who's still making life and death saving throws. The target must succeed on a difficulty 10 Constitution saving throw against this magical feature or die. Just flat die. No life and death saving throws. If the wisp manages to knock you unconscious with its lightning damage attack, which is quite likely, especially if you're a wizard or something, As a bonus action on the same turn, it can consume your life, instantly killing you before you have a chance to make any life and death saving throws, after which point the Wisp regains 3d6 hit points. It only starts off with 9d4, an average of 22, so there's a chance that it could become almost as powerful as it was when it first started by simply killing someone. A challenge rating 2 creature that can instantly kill people might be seen as a bit of a cheap way to kill someone off, might be seen as a really good challenge, but it certainly seems like a serious ramp up in tension and challenge for players who are not expecting this. This provides no opportunity for a healer to come and save the day, and these things can fly 50 feet per movement action. So even if someone has fallen unconscious a decent way away on the battlefield, a Wisp can kind of mop them up, killing off party members with an immeasurable level of ease that I think very few creatures in the monster manual actually have access to. So use caution when employing a will-o'-the-wisp, because they're very likely to be underestimated, they're very low challenge rating, and they might make a death feel cheap in the eyes of your players unless they're ready for something like this. Otherwise, they're really great creatures, they're an interesting thing to fight, and personally as a DM, I've not decided to use one yet. They almost require the meta knowledge of what they're capable of. It might be worth having an old witch or wizard, an old person who's lived in the marsh or the bog, leave a warning for the players in some capacity of the level of danger that they face when dealing with the will-o'-the-wisp, so they can appropriately plan. So long as this isn't a surprise, and so long as there is some kind of foreshadowing and forewarning in advance that your players definitely get before the encounter, these creatures can be absolutely great fun and are absolute powerhouses at challenge rating 2. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. I hope you enjoyed the drawing as well, and if you have anything that you'd like to see me draw and hear me cover, make sure to leave that down below in the comment section. And until next time, happy monster hunting.